Have you ever wondered what really happens when fog covers the world? My name is Sarah Jennings, and the discoveries I made about Project Nexus changed everything. Neural control implants, reality warping portals, and a secret that connects our existence to entities beyond human understanding. If you are fascinated by mysteries and conspiracies that defy logic, subscribe to the channel now. Leave your comment about what you think is happening. Ooh, and don't forget to check out the special gift I pinned in the comments. What is happening to the world? Have you ever stopped to think about the grim coincidences that seem to surround recent headlines? All of Los Angeles is on fire right now. Smoke darkens the horizon, and reports of chaos emerge every second. Have you heard about the strange fogs that have appeared in Denver and New Orleans, and the disappearances? People disappear without a trace, while rumors of voices and shadows in the smoke spread. Does this seem like a fluke to you? My name is Sarah Jennings, and I learned the hard way that coincidences are rarely what they seem. My life is living proof of this. Until 2023, I was a communications analyst at one of the most influential government agencies. My specialty: decipher hidden messages and speeches, find patterns invisible to ordinary eyes. I was good at what I did. Too good, perhaps. That's what ruined me. It all started when I noticed something wrong in the official speeches. It was as if an invisible hand was guiding every word, every pause, every gesture. There was a pattern, something I couldn't ignore. When I tried to alert my superiors, I was ignored. When I insisted, I was dismissed. Stress, they said. You need to rest, Sarah. But I knew what they really meant. You know too much. My resignation should have been the end, but it became the beginning of a new search. Without the constraints of my position, I began to dig deeper. I scoured news, reports, even trivial posts on social media. Gradually, patterns emerged. Seemingly unconnected crises were, in fact, interconnected. They all pointed to something bigger, something that would culminate in 2025. Then, earlier this year, the video emerged, a clip republished by the White House with the inoffensive title, "Time to Move On." 52 seconds of carefully edited images, masked people, inspiring words like union and hope, accompanied by an emotional soundtrack. For most, it was just a generic motivational message. For me, it was a wake-up call. I watched the video dozens of times, analyzing every frame, every transition. The images were too precise, the words too carefully calculated. Why mask the population in a reposted video? Why use terms like rebuild and adapt so insistently? In that last frame, a fleeting glimpse of a document that shouldn't be there. Pausing at just the right moment, I managed to make out a name: Department of Government Efficiency. That name became my obsession. Who were they, and what were they doing? With the help of old contacts, I delved into confidential files and found references to the New Tomorrow Project. Officially, it was a post-crisis unification campaign, but among the memos, I discovered something disturbing: mass perceptual control. An internal note described the objective with cool clarity: instill a sense of security while preparing the ground for structural change. Control was not just about narratives, it was about reality. Messages, images, even patterns of light, designed to shape how people perceive the world. And the video was just the beginning. As I discovered this, the world began to change. Dense and inexplicable fogs appeared in several cities: Denver, New Orleans, and now Los Angeles. People disappeared. Others returned, different. They reported whispers in the fog, shadows that moved. The authorities dismissed it all as mass hysteria, but I knew it was connected to what I had discovered. My attempts to expose this were ignored or ridiculed. "Sarah, you're obsessed," former colleagues said, until the warning started. Cars parked for hours in front of my house. Silent phone calls in the middle of the night. And then, the note: "You know too much." But how could I stop? Every day, 2025 approaches. And now, with Los Angeles burning and the fog rolling in, I know we're out of time. Something big is coming, something that will change everything. They are not just manipulating us, they are transforming us. And if you don't wake up now, it might be too late. It all started with the fog. It was a cold morning in Denver when the first reports emerged. A dense, thick fog, as if the entire city was being suffocated by a blanket of poisoned cotton. No one knew where it came from or why it didn't dissipate. Even with the sun high, reports of missing people began to emerge on social media, and stranger still, they were accompanied by stories that defied reason, voices whispering through the fog, shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. New Orleans was next. A sunset that should have bathed the Mississippi in golden hues was replaced by an early darkness. The fog, now in another part of the country, seemed to move like a predator, swallowing entire streets. Some said they saw figures walking within it, figures that disappeared as soon as they were stared at long enough. Others swore they heard distant, almost hypnotic singing that made them feel an inexplicable calm before panic took over. And then came Los Angeles. The news was still mixed, but what was certain was that the city was on fire. The images showed empty streets filled with smoke that mixed with fog, reports of explosions, chaos, and a constant emphasis on disappearances flooded social media. People reported seeing eyes within the mist, a fleeting glow that disappeared before they could understand what they were looking at. The connection was clear to me, even if to the rest of the world it seemed like just a collective delusion. This was not a climate anomaly. It was an experiment getting out of control. As I began to hear the first rumors, memories of the subliminal messages in the White House video came flooding back. The words rebuild, hope, and change echoed in my mind. They were concepts very similar to those reported by those who had survived contact with the fog, a feeling of loss and rebirth, an almost transcendental sensation before terror. But it wasn't just sensations. The people who reappeared, the ones who supposedly survived the mist, were not the same. Their eyes were empty. Their voices were slower, as if they were echoing from somewhere far away. They talked about things that didn't make sense. The great unification, the final cycle. They are coming. That's when I decided to dive deeper. If the video contained clues about this, perhaps there was something more behind that mysterious entity, the Department of Government Efficiency. My access to leaked documents was a mix of luck and desperation. An old contact of mine, an analyst who had been moved to a lesser role after disagreeing with internal policies, got in touch. He had found something he couldn't understand, but knew I could decipher. "Sarah, this is heavy. I don't know what it means, but something tells me you'll want to see it." The package arrived a week later. There were text files, memos, and even images of what appeared to be device prototypes. The name, Project Nexus, was in almost all documents. In one of the reports, there was a detailed description: neural technology applied for large-scale control, initial implementation in urban populations as a crisis management measure, expected results, reduced social tension, and increased compliance. Mass neural control. The words chilled my spine. They weren't just trying to monitor the population, they were trying to mold her. And the most terrifying thing, the experiment had already begun. Another document explicitly cited the use of environmental agents to create what they called modified sensory layers. It was a vague description, but clear enough for me to understand. Were they using the mist to spread something? Chemicals? Nanotechnology? It was impossible to know. It altered people's perceptions, but it wasn't just that. There was a connection between Elon Musk and Vivek, the supposed leaders of that department. Internal documents showed that the two were behind the financing of revolutionary technologies. The official line was that these innovations would be used to manage crises, pandemics, economic collapses, even climate disasters. But the records I found indicated something much more sinister. Moss had invested billions in neurotechnology companies, while Vivek led research into neural interference. I started connecting the dots. The White House video wasn't just a call for unity, it was preparation. The fog, the disappearances, the bizarre returns. It was all part of an experiment on a national scale. And from what I could see, Los Angeles was the center of everything. My investigation, however, did not go unnoticed. The day after I received the files, I found my mailbox broken into. My computer was hacked, and the next night, I heard footsteps outside my house. When I opened the door, there was a note stuck in the wood. Stop. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. They were transforming the world before our eyes, and most people didn't even know what was happening. Now, the smoke of Los Angeles can be seen from space. The fog spreads like a living plague, and I know this is just the beginning. Something bigger is coming, something we can't stop. And what scares me most is that maybe they don't want to stop. It was not easy to find the video. It was buried deep within the internet, hidden among corrupted files and broken links. When I finally managed to access it, a shiver ran down my spine. It was as if the video shouldn't exist, as if it had been deleted forever, for a very specific reason. It was dated weeks before the first report of the fogs in Denver. When I clicked play, my screen was filled with images that left me breathless. The filming was precarious, made with a low-quality camera, shaky and in constant movement. But what was being captured was clear as day. Hooded figures, wrapped in black cloaks, were arranged in a perfect circle. On the floor between them, a pulsating symbol shone. It was a mix of sacred geometry and chaotic shapes, as if the design were something alive, pulsating. The lines moved, or maybe it was just a trick of the light. I wasn't sure. The circle was not just a meeting, this was a ritual. Each hooded figure seemed to know exactly where they were supposed to be and what they were supposed to do. There were no voices, no audible chants, but their movements were synchronized, as if they were obeying a beat that I couldn't hear. In the center of the circle, something moved. It was a distorted glow, a ripple in the air, like heat emanating from a hot surface. It was a portal. I knew this even before my brain formulated the words. My mind immediately jumped to Diana's notes. She had disappeared months before I left the agency, but her name kept coming up in my investigation. Shortly after his abrupt departure, I received an anonymous package at my home. Inside, it was Diana's diary, a worn-out notebook with pages filled with feverish notes and scribbles. Many of the things she wrote seemed like delusions at the time, but now, watching that video, they made sense. On one of the most worn pages, Diana had written, "Portals to the invisible. They are trying to break through the barrier, but they don't understand what's on the other side. They are trying to force a balance, but balance between what? Worlds that should never come together. Cross." At the time, I interpreted this as a metaphor for surveillance or invasive technologies, but now, faced with the images I saw, I understood that Diana was talking about something literal. Her words kept echoing in my mind as I watched the video again, pausing for every detail. The symbol on the floor seemed to call to me, almost mesmerizing. And then, I noticed something I hadn't noticed the first time. The edges of the circle were surrounded by equipment, monitors, cables, and something that looked like an antenna pointed directly at the center of the portal. It wasn't just a ritual, it was also science. That night, I sat at my desk, rereading Diana's diary and reviewing the files I had obtained. There was a document, part of the Nexus project, that talked about dimensional bridges and the manipulation of human sensory layers. The words were technical, but the meaning was clear. The fogs were not natural. They were byproducts of experiments with these portals. They were trying to open passages between dimensions, but the process was not stable. The portals leaked, and what leaked out was changing people. The reports mentioned altered states of consciousness, neural confusion, and, in extreme cases, irreversible depersonalization. But what disturbed me most were the records of the behavior of the disappeared who returned. Many of them spoke of voices that guided them through the fog, of eyes that watched them. Others seemed unable to form complete sentences, as if something had erased parts of their minds. And there were those who came back different. Their expressions, their ways of speaking, even their memories seemed disconnected from what they were before. I knew the situation was out of control, but what terrified me most was the idea that it wasn't just the government behind this. The hooded figures in the video didn't look like scientists. They were something different, something older, more dangerous. With each passing day, the news about the fogs became more alarming. Los Angeles was practically uninhabitable. The streets were empty, except for emergency patrols. People reported sounds coming from the fog, pops, murmurs, and the occasional muffled scream. In Denver, authorities tried to contain the panic, but disappearances continued to increase, and New Orleans now had entire neighborhoods abandoned, consumed by fog. I started connecting the dots, the White House video, the subliminal messages, Project Nexus, and now the ritual video. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. They weren't just playing with technology, They were trying to open doors to the invisible, and in doing so, they were bringing something to our side. In that last excerpt from Diana's diary, she had written, "If they continue, it won't just be what's here that will be changed. It will be us. The invisible is not a place, it's a state, and they are trying to take us there." I wondered for a moment if Diana had lost herself in this experience. Maybe she had gotten too close. But now, what terrified me more than anything else was the possibility that she was right. Maybe it wasn't just about the mists or the portals. Maybe they were trying to change something fundamental about who we are. And maybe, just maybe, whatever was on the other side was waiting for this. Everything I feared was happening faster than I could have imagined. The fog, previously confined to isolated regions, now spread with a veracity that defied explanation. Denver was practically uninhabitable. New Orleans no longer had any trace of its ongoing joy. And Los Angeles, well, Los Angeles had become an apocalyptic landscape. The streets were deserted except for military patrols and the few who dared to challenge the unknown. It was as if the city was being devoured by something alive, something that was hiding within the mist. The disappearances continued to grow, and the stories of those returning were even more disturbing. Some people just weren't the same. His eyes were empty, as if a part of them had been trapped in the fog. Others, even apparently normal, could not remember where they had been or what they had seen. But what really terrified me was what I discovered when I started investigating the recovered bodies. It was in Denver that I found the first concrete clue. Thanks to an anonymous contact, someone who seemed to share my horror and obsession, I had access to a small clandestine morgue where victims' bodies were analyzed away from the government site. The place was small, cramped, but what I saw there changed everything. There were implants. The doctors performing the autopsies seemed as confused as I was. Small devices, the size of a grain of rice, were inserted into the base of some of the victims' skulls. Most of them appeared to be burned or deactivated, but even so, their purposes were clear. Control, the same type of technology that the Project Nexus reports mentioned. It was as if these people had been used as guinea pigs in a grotesque experiment, and most disturbingly, the devices were not surgically implanted. They were integrated into the flesh, as if they had grown there. It was during these investigations that I met Henry. He found me on one of the underground forums where conspiracists and theorists exchanged information. At first, I didn't trust him. A tall man with a tired look and scars that betrayed years of battle. He looked more like a lost adventurer than a reliable ally. But Henry wasn't just anyone. He was an ex-military hacker, someone who had seen things up close, much closer than I had. "I know what you're looking for," he said when we first met in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Denver, "and I can guarantee it's worse than you imagine." Henry had worked directly on defense systems, and at one point in his career had access to snippets of what he called the hidden agenda. He didn't know who was pulling the strings, but he had seen the names: Elon Musk, Vivek, and the Department of Government Efficiency. According to Henry, they were trying to create a unified network, a global control system that would eliminate traditional leadership and replace it with a centralized structure. "They're using fear," he explained as he showed me files he had hacked. "The fog, the disappearances, it's all part of the plan. The more scared we get, the easier it will be for them to convince the world that they need to intervene. And once that happens, there will be no turning back." The documents Henry gave me were frighteningly detailed. Project Nexus diagrams showed how the implants were designed to integrate with the human nervous system. They didn't just monitor, they could manipulate. Mass neural control, one page read. And then there was another file, marked ultra-confidential. It was a proposal to replace governments with something called a central decision network, which would be controlled entirely by artificial intelligence. "Do you realize what this means?" Henry asked, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and despair. "They want to take power out of people's hands and hand it over to a system that no one can question. They want to erase human leadership and turn us into parts of a machine." I knew he was right. Everything I had discovered pointed to this conclusion. The fog was no accident. The disappearances, the implants, the portals, it was all part of a meticulous plan to reshape the world. But what haunted me most was the question none of us could answer. Who or what was really behind this. With Henry's files in hand, I knew my next task would be more dangerous than anything I had ever done. I needed to get this out into the world before it was too late. But at the same time, I knew that each step took me closer to an enemy I could barely understand. I knew my life had reached a point of no return. I had discovered too much, seen enough to understand that the world as we knew it was on the brink of collapse. The evidence was before me: the mists, the disappearances, the implants, the portals. And now, with Henry's files in hand, I had the final piece of the puzzle. But what to do with it? The decision was clear. I needed to speak. I needed to show the world what was happening before it was too late. Even knowing the risk, I prepared a live broadcast. I chose a remote location, far from conventional networks, and set up an independent network. The message would be brief, but explosive. If I could reach even a portion of people, maybe that would be enough to trigger a chain reaction. The night was cold and silent. A tense calm hung in the air as I made final adjustments to the equipment. The lights from the laptop illuminated my face, reflecting the weight of my decision. Henry had insisted on helping me, but I knew he would be safer away from here. If something happened to me, at least he would still have the files. I began the broadcast with a steady voice, but fear pulsed through every word. If you're seeing this, it means they haven't found me yet. My name is Sarah Jennings, and I have information you need to hear. The mist that is spreading is not natural. It is not a coincidence or an unexplained phenomenon. It's deliberate. I explained about Project Nexus, about the implants, about the disappearances. Each word seemed to cut through the air, revealing secrets that should never come to light. But as I spoke, something changed. A chill ran down my spine, and a distant sound invaded the silence. Footsteps. I looked outside, and my breath caught in my throat. They were there, shadowy figures, motionless, spread across the field around the shed. Their silhouettes were almost indistinguishable from the darkness, but their eyes glowed with a faint orange hue that seemed to pulse in time with my racing heart. "They're here," I whispered to the camera, waiting for the right moment to silence the truth. I continued speaking, my voice shaky but determined. "What you need to understand is that the mist doesn't just turn people into puppets. It is a conduit, a portal to something much greater, much older than any of us can comprehend." As I spoke, flashes of memory flooded my mind. Diana's words about portals to the invisible, the reports that mentioned dimensional interference. Everything made sense now. People weren't just disappearing. They were being taken, used as tools for something coming from the other side. These entities, which I call the Ancients, are not something we can conceive of, I continued, trying to ignore the growing sound of footsteps outside. They have no form or motivations that we can understand, but they want to get in, and the fog is the way. Suddenly, the laptop's lights flickered, and the sound of interference filled the transmission. I knew time was running out. "You must resist," I shouted, trying to overcome the noise. "Don't trust them. Don't trust what you see or hear. They will try to break you from the inside out." It was at that moment that the warehouse door exploded. A cold wind invaded the space, carrying fragments of the mist with it. The figures entered, and I saw their faces for the first time, or rather, the lack of them. His features were erased, almost fluid, as if they were just molds of something that was once human. The transmission dropped. No one knows for sure what happened after that. Some say my message managed to spread before being erased by control systems. Others believe that I was captured, silenced, like so many others before me. But what I do know is that as long as there is one person willing to listen, the truth still has a chance. The fog continues to spread, and with it, the power of the Ancients grows. I don't know how much time we have left, but I know the fight is not over. If you are reading this, know that resistance starts with you. Don't trust the fog. Don't trust what they show. And above all, don't let them in. I knew they were coming, even as a live stream continued choppy, with the sound distorted and images flickering. There was something in me that screamed to keep going. It was as if every word I spoke was a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. But I couldn't give up. They could silence me, but the truth needed to come out. The footsteps outside were getting louder and louder. I had minutes, maybe seconds, before everything fell apart, but I couldn't stop. I connected the drive, containing all the files Henry had collected to my network, initiating the transfer to a group of independent journalists who I knew hadn't yet been corrupted by the system. It was the only chance for the truth to survive, even if I didn't. The laptop screen showed the progress bar, 25%, then 30%, slowly, agonizingly slow. Every second seemed to last an eternity. Meanwhile, my mind raced, reliving every discovery, every moment that led me here. The connections, the portals, the ancients. It all pointed to something much bigger than simple human conspiracy. "You need to hear this," I continued, my voice shaking but firm. "They are using the fog for something much greater than simple control. She is a channel. They want to turn us into doors, into bridges, to something that doesn't belong to our world." I explained about Project Nexus, about the implants, about the disappearances. Each word seemed to cut through the air, revealing secrets that should never come to light. But as I spoke, something changed. A chill ran down my spine, and a distant sound invaded the silence. Footsteps. These were not just ordinary steps. They were slow, deliberate, as if each movement was calculated to increase my tension. I looked outside, and my breath caught in my throat. They were there, shadowy figures, motionless, spread across the field around the shed. Their silhouettes were almost indistinguishable from the darkness, but their eyes glowed with a faint orange hue that seemed to pulse in time with my racing heart. "They're here," I whispered to the camera, waiting for the right moment to silence the truth. I continued speaking, my voice shaky but determined. "What you need to understand is that the mist doesn't just turn people into puppets. It is a conduit, a portal to something much greater, much older than any of us can comprehend." As I spoke, flashes of memory flooded my mind. Diana's words about portals to the invisible, the reports that mentioned dimensional interference. Everything made sense now. People weren't just disappearing. They were being taken, used as tools for something coming from the other side. The progress bar reached 70%, then 80%, but the sound of footsteps was now so close that it seemed to echo inside the warehouse. The door creaked, as if something very heavy was approaching. Suddenly, the laptop's lights flickered, and the connection was interrupted for a moment. My eyes fixed on the progress bar. 90%. I needed to buy more time. "These entities, which I call the Ancients, are not something we can conceive of," I continued, trying to ignore the growing sound of footsteps outside. "They have no form or motivations that we can understand, but they want to get in, and the fog is the way." It was at that moment that the warehouse door exploded. A cold wind invaded the space, carrying fragments of the mist with it. The figures entered, and I saw their faces for the first time, or rather, the lack of them. His features were erased, almost fluid, as if they were just molds of something that was once human. The progress bar reached 100%. At the exact moment I felt a cold, invisible hand wrap around my arm. The transmission dropped, the screen went dark, and silence took over. No one knows for sure what happened to her after that. Some say her message managed to spread before being erased by control systems. Others believe she was captured, silenced, like so many others before her. Days later, small snippets of the transmission began to appear in underground resistance cells. The message echoed among those still willing to listen. Don't trust the fog, don't trust what they show, and above all, don't let them in. The question of what happened to her is not what matters. What matters is what happens now. They are here, among us, waiting for the right moment to complete what they started. Every piece of information we can spread is a spark of resistance, and every person who decides to fight against this control is a barrier against the unknown. If you saw this message, there is still time, but not much. The fog continues to spread, and the ancients continue to strengthen their power. Let's be clear, this is not just about survival. It's about preserving what makes us human. When the fog reaches you, remember, the fight begins with those who still believe that the world can resist. If you've come this far, it's because you're looking for the truth, so don't let it be silenced. Subscribe to the channel now to stay connected to the darkest revelations and secrets that they don't want you to know. Turn on notifications to never miss a new alert. Comment and share. Every click is a step against their control. Together, we are the resistance. But remember, time is running out, and the next message could be the last.